Hello and welcome to the I3 lecture series hosted by the Masters in Digital Photography program at the School of Visual Arts. We're thrilled to have photographer John Trotter as tonight's guest speaker. A native of Missouri, John worked as a newspaper photojournalist for 14 years on stories large and small, local and international. He photographed people and events ranging from local high school athletes to national political conventions, and documented the United States military interventions in Panama, Haiti, and Somalia. In 1997, while photographing in Sacramento, California, a gang of a half a dozen angry young men accosted him, demanding his film. John was severely beaten, left for dead, bleeding on a sidewalk. His series, The Burden of Memory, chronicles the traumatic event and the long road back to recovery. In 2001, John began photographing in Mexico for his epic project No Agua, No Vida, about the human alteration of the Colorado River. He has photographed along the entire 1,400-mile length of the river. I met John a year or two after the attack. It's gone back a while. And every year since, I guess my admiration for you just keeps growing. I think you will meet few photographers that are more dedicated to the medium and even less who have a more compelling vision of the human condition. So please help me welcome John Trotter to the lecture series.
Okay. So I don't do this very much, and I don't really know. I've been to a few of these presentations. It's really great presentations by some really great photographers, but we all come at this from different places, and how do you describe a photographic life and how to get there? There's a lot that I'm not going to show you. I can just say I fell in love with photography probably in high school, like everybody else who saw the image appear on the magic paper, in the darkroom. That's what hooked me in, I think. But after high school, after getting out of high school, I did this sort of a detour because I was also a cyclist, and I ended up going to France for a while, living in France and racing on a cycling team there, and until I decided that I didn't really want to spend the best years of my life, trying to be a professional bicycle racer, and so I came back and thought, well, what the hell? I guess I'll go to this University of Missouri, which had a fairly well-known, the first of the photojournalism programs, and then entered into a career in newspaper photojournalism, and always wondered what it always felt more like it wasn't going to be my entire life, and then Jaime alluded to it, and I'll just play this, and I had this here. I was actually, in my head, I was going to be talking, so you can look at this and sort of let it sink in. But you'll see maybe what this means in a second.
On the evening of March 23, 1997, as I finished a long, thoughtful bike ride just after sundown, I looked up to see the darkening sky flanked by the beginning of what would be a near-total lunar eclipse in the east, and the frozen streak of the Hale-Bopp comet in the west. The next afternoon was warm and lovely as I walked with my cameras through Sacramento's worn Oak Park neighborhood. searching for a picture for the newspaper in the clean spring light that dappled through the new leaves on the trees. Children were everywhere. But unlike most other days, this day went very badly, very quickly, though the memories of it are shrouded in fog for me. In my mind, I can still see a green 1970 Chevy Impala roar angrily around a corner and screech to a stop directly across the street from where I was standing. The light on Tarachi Golston, when he emerged from his car, was the kind of light I'd been looking for all day. He was screaming for my film. And then he hit me. During the part I can't remember, he and the 5 other accomplices who had me surrounded when he arrived kicked, stomped, and jumped on me, then left me for dead. Except I didn't die. Sometime later, I came to understand that I was a resident at a quiet, pine-paneled brain injury rehabilitation facility called Sierra Gates. I couldn't walk. I stuttered, and my entire left side tingled, as though it were asleep. I couldn't remember 3 numbers just recited to me by a speech therapist, and all the plans I'd made for the future seemed to belong to another life. I endured 2.5 exhausting months of stumbling, humbling therapy there, alongside other equally confused souls with brains injured by car crashes, assaults, strokes, aneurysms. We all lived with a blank spot in our memories, representing the events that had swept over each of us like a tsunami, drowning the lives we'd known. 6 months after my release, still very cognitively and physically broken, I decided to return to Sierra Gates with my camera to try to learn to be a photographer again, to try to understand what had happened to me by observing the lives of those who were living in the first place I knew after my attack, to try to understand the blank spot.
Ich klagen, könnt ich zagen, irre sein an mir und dir. Nein, ich will im Busen tragen deinen Himmel schon allhier und dies Herz, ehe es zusammenbricht, trinkt noch Glut
Okay. I never know what it's going to be like to see him again. Interestingly enough, Jaime asked me when I could talk, what date, and I just thought, okay, maybe March 28th. And I guess I didn't think too much about it at the time, but so March 24th was the day of the attack, and actually, despite as bad as the attack really was, I was out of the hospital fairly soon, and so tomorrow would be exactly 20 days, 20 years, 20 years ago that I actually was admitted to Sierra Gates, and event which was, really huge in my life, and which I have no memory of at all, and I don't remember going there. I virtually remember nothing about the hospital, and so there I was, and suddenly I wasn't. I'd been, like most of you know, I'm going into my work every day, and I have things I'm planning on doing, and then suddenly I'm not, and my whole experience of the world is very different, and so what to do, and how? And I guess this is a talk about photography, and not just about being a human being, but sometimes they're not mutually exclusive. So my girlfriend at the time did encourage me. I says, keep writing in your journal. So I thought, okay, yeah, I should. This is kind of, I should write about what's going on with me, and then my short-term memory was so bad. I was able to at least look at my journal and say, okay, so that really, I kind of remembered that, so it really did happen. And eventually, even though I wasn't really capable of photographing when I was there were a few kind of pitiful attempts. Someone brought my camera to me, and I didn't even remember that they brought it to me. And so eventually, I was released, and still going back to Sierra Gates on sort of, what do they call it? It wasn't work release. That's prison. That was a day client. That's what they called me. So I would come out, and my speech therapist one day said, okay, so I'd like for you to start taking pictures again. And do you think you can do that? And I thought, oh, yeah, sure, I think I can take pictures again. And, well, what would you like to photograph? And I thought about it, and I decided that I would, Sierra Gates, I would go there. I was actually, there was a big part of me, besides just the inability to photograph, there was a part of me that was actually terrified of being a photographer again, because of photographing again, because I had been attacked because I was a photographer, and it was sort of a really direct attack on my the way I identified who I was, and so. But I felt safe out there. I knew that it was I couldn't deal with too many things going on at once. I still not so great at that, but so I went out there and I started photographing. And how does it become, this? I just kept going out and photographing. I didn't really have any plan about what I was going to do with any of these. It just felt like I was just photographing, And sometimes that's what we have to do, I guess, as photographers. And sometimes we have a plan, you know, a direction that we want, where we want to go, and other times, you know, I had never really worked on anything quite this long, and so I was more or less an assignment photographer, but you know, and I'd never really photographed my own life so much, and I think a lot of photographers who aren't photojournalists, you know, it doesn't seem like an unnatural thing to do at all. A lot of people photograph their own experience, but it wasn't something I really, you know, that we sort of did, and so, I mean, and all this stuff, I mean, this is suddenly is part of my life. And, you know, meanwhile, I'm out photographing at Sierra Gates, and there's this long involved there. It took 8 months to arrest all the accomplices because all the people who were on the street were too terrified to be witnesses. And they arrested the main guy because they arrested him because he on murdering somebody later in the same week, and so he was out the street, but all the juveniles were out there, and I wouldn't have known them if we were in the same elevator together. I wouldn't have recognized them. So I was, you know, I was afraid to be out in public for a while. Yeah, I mean, all this stuff became part of my life. I'm photographing at Sierra Gates, and this is sort of the backstory. While I'm out there, I'm having to go through 3 different trials where I have to be a witness, and you know, I forget how many thousands of pages of discovery for my case. It was, and you know, it's not just me. It's my mom and dad. Every now and then I would, at the time, partially because of my memory, my short-term memory was so kind of broken, and then the circumstances were so crazy. I remember I was in a meeting with my mom and dad, and I just got up and I took 2 pictures just so I could look at it and believe that this was really happening, you know. And so he's basically the DA. There were 2. This is, you can see the one on the one side and then the Kevin on the left. Those were the 2. They had 2 assistant DAs working on this, and you know, they're telling my parents all the details of this stuff. And this is right before the trial started for the main guy, and you know, and so I'm going. I don't know what to do with all this stuff. You know, there's an aerial map of the neighborhood where the attack happened on the wall. There's transcripts from jail phone calls that the guy has made, and letters. And he was on the same wing as the Unabomber, in fact, at that time, in the Sacramento County Jail. And I'm photographing Sierra Gates, and every now and then just sort of photographing. And actually, very, very few people have ever seen a couple of these pictures. They were just, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what you're supposed to do. You know, I didn't know what to do. So I just would occasionally take pictures of, of myself, and this actually was a picture from from Death Valley, where we're going there again. I wanted to go to Death Valley on the 1st anniversary of the attack, partially because I love the desert, and another part of me, I just wanted to be able to see everything around me, you know, because I was still very traumatized by how quickly the attack happened. These people sort of came from somewhere, and I felt safe in some way just being out there and being able to see around me. And but this is kind of a segue, I guess. You can see, the big open sky. There was a sense of freedom somehow from all these circumstances that I felt trapped in for well over a couple of years. And so eventually the trials were over. About 3 of the juveniles were incarcerated. The main attacker is still incarcerated and not apparently living a really redemptive life in prison. And though I hope actually he can at some point understand, that would be good. And so I had been thinking seriously about moving to New York before all this happened, and it's a complicated story, and I'm already probably running over. So, but so I did. I when I felt well enough, about a year and a half after this trial ended and everything, that was over, I ended up getting a residency at Lightwork, where was kind of a gift. I actually had something in my life to look forward to after the trial, which for the longest time was the only thing. There was just nothing past the trial existed in my mind. And then actually during, I think, the jury deliberation, I got a call from Lightwork, and they said, "Yo, you want to come up and have a residency?" And I said, "Gosh, yeah, okay." And so I printed pretty much every day that I had the ability to print. I printed these Sierra Gates pictures up there, and about a year after that, I moved to Brooklyn, and I've been there ever since. I mean, what a crazy thing that was to do, but I wasn't going to stay in California. I didn't really have anything to gain by staying there, and I guess after you lose a lot, you think, what else can I lose? What could happen? That hasn't already happened. So, and then the first thing I do, I still missed parts of the West, and and moving to California, I remember from Missouri, there was this point where the rain stopped in April, and then it didn't rain at all. It didn't rain at all until October. And I remember the day it started raining, I actually walked outside into the middle of the street and stood in the rain, and I thought, how does this place exist? How do we even have this place? So I started getting interested about water issues and how, the incredible gyrations we've gone through to engineer an existence in a very dry place, and the Colorado River especially just captivated me, and because it's. I think, so I read a piece in a, I don't know how many people have even heard of the High Country News here, but maybe one or two, maybe nobody. But I used to subscribe to it. It was about the Intermountain West, and there was a great piece about the Colorado River Delta, and I thought, that's where I should go. I'm just going to go there. And so, not in a really willful way, but in some, I don't know, I wanted to be working around the anniversary instead of just sitting there staring at the ceiling. And so somehow I ended up in Mexico. And the first day I started photographing, it wasn't a real plan. I don't know if I was really planning anything at that point, but so it turned out, there I was photographing on this, I guess the 4th anniversary of the attack. somehow I made it down there, speaking very, very little Spanish. So I'll just go into these pictures now. And I mean, some of the people that I discovered right away were the Kukapa people who had lived there, and their name for themselves means the people of the river, and their entire society, their culture and their beliefs were built around the way the river would run until things started to change, and Hoover Dam was built. You know, it was such a cultural and engineering triumph for us to build Hoover Dam, but imagine how the river dropped off for people with no television, maybe no radio. Suddenly the river turned into more of a trickle as they're filling Lake Mead behind Hoover Dam in 1936. And these are people, you know, that, I don't know if no one had ever built a dam like that. How could it, you know, you try and imagine what you would think living down in this delta. He's now deceased. She was the oldest living Kukapa, Pascuala, and Onesimo has also passed away since I photographed this. And one of the biggest things that they do there, their main income, is that they fish for corvina, which is a sea bass that so it comes up to spawn up into the channel of the Colorado, which at this point is basically being, I mean, the river there, the tide comes in, it raises 15 feet. And before the dams, when the current of the river would meet the tide, the incoming tide, it was incredibly violent. It could be, especially on a higher tide, it could be very violent. And in the springtime, when the runoff was great, and you know, there's stories about white people coming up the river in boats and looking at these Kukapa people standing on the side of the rivers, you know, like, look how stupid they look. They're just kind of staring at us. And the Kukapa people are saying, look how stupid. Who would go up the river when, you know, like the tide's coming in? Don't they know this is going to flip their boats over? And in fact, you know, that's what happened. A lot of people drown like that. But they're fishing for corvina around right now, this time of the year. And since things have, there's so many dams have come in over the years that about 95% of what was one of the great wetlands of the world has basically turned into a desert. And so they're kind of desert fishing. You can see it's just a wasteland sort of behind them. This was all a wetland at one point. That's the chief's granddaughter, Media Luna. And there's this biosphere reserve, you know, which is a great idea to try and save what's left of the natural world. But these are the people, and I think it's very common. People forget that there are people living in these places, and this is their home. And so often they're not consulted in any way about how about the management of what's left. And so this is the chief's daughter and cousins and sisters. It seems like all of the fishing licenses in the Kukapa community are held by women. But she's being made, you can see the Mexican Marines in the back of the pickup. So they're basically making her sign this acta. They're saying, you know, you can no longer fish in the nucleus zone of the biosphere reserve. You know, we don't care that there's only 300 of you left. And this is where your entire world was. You got to, you know, fend for yourselves. They have no water rights. They don't even have land along the Colorado River. And so, and this is, this is down right at the mouth of what's left. I mean, anything that's coming down the Colorado River at this point is irrigation runoff, because as what's left of the river comes into Mexico, Mexico gets an allotment. Everybody gets there's 7 states and Mexico. Everybody gets a set amount of water every year. And but right at the border, the Morelos Dam turns almost the entire flow of the river into these canals for irrigation. So there's almost nothing going down the main stem of the river anymore. And so it's all just some irrigation runoff. The river itself doesn't even go to the ocean. It just sort of dies, and then some irrigation water comes further down off into the old channel, and that's about it. And that's really, when I first went down there, that's what I thought I would do. I would just photograph the delta, and I thought that would be enough. And then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, okay, if I really want to explain what has happened here, I kind of have to explain what's happened north of the border. And that was kind of stupid, because it opened me up to this enormous geographic area, not just along the river, but all the places where the river's water goes. This is up in Rocky Mountain National Park, kind of north and west of Denver. And all rivers have multiple headwaters, but the river that's called the Colorado actually starts there in Rocky Mountain National Park. And it's so different there. And still, not everything is changing with the river as well as everything else. But all the things, and we have even today's news, we have such a triumph now that we've basically decided to, as a country, ignore global warming, climate change. And so nevertheless, the warming temperatures mean that there's not as deep of a freeze in the winter, and the mountain bark beetles are able to survive, and lodgepole pines are being tens and tens of thousands of acres all over the West are being eaten up by these. And there's erosion, there's the river evaporates further down, but I'm sort of bouncing around here, partially because I thought that these sort of were together, but this is because of, this is what we've done with the water that starts up there and used to end in Mexico. This is Tucson, Arizona, and as you can see, it just goes on and on to the horizon. And essentially it became possible for that to happen in the early 1980s when the Central Arizona Water Project canals was finished. So the water goes from the Colorado River at Lake Havasu for about 300 miles out to Tucson. It goes to Phoenix, which is only 175 miles maybe from the river. And of course, Las Vegas is the closest major city to the river, and they were pumping groundwater somehow. That means sort of this Las Vegas, the springs, right, more or less. And up until the Rat Pack era, and then they had to start getting water out of Lake Mead, and now they're 90% dependent on Colorado River water to have this, fantasy world out in the middle of the desert where you're going to have, your Venetian gondola ride in the desert. And where, it's basically, I've always thought it was sort of the ultimate expression of the American dream. You sort of economize for prosperity, something for nothing. It's kind of how we roll. And you know, this is at the time, this was a stalled out suburb going out into the desert, and they'd already installed the sprinkler irrigation system, so there was it was automatically just watering whatever, you know. It was crazy. It was like a sci-fi novel or something, where these sort of things that we built continued after we were no longer there, or there was no use for them, except this is before they were even used. And you know, meanwhile, back in the Delta, you have this, and this is because we want to build what we built in the American West. You have a former wetland here, where there's about 2 inches of rain a year. This is, I think this picture was taken in April. It was 108 degrees. There's so much of of the water is put into agriculture. This is, you know, just south of the border in Sonora, carrots, which would be right around this time of year. Probably, you know, you should see where your carrots are coming from. It's in the winter, the Imperial and Coachella valleys in Southern California, maybe 80–90% of our winter vegetables come from there. And it's totally irrigated by the Colorado River. And meanwhile, you have, I mean, it's affected everything. These are native fish that are in an aquarium. There are so few of these left. These are bony-tailed chubs that they were evolved for the way the river was. They would survive in muddy water, and then they had evolved to deal with flash flooding. And it's always indicative when all the introduced species, the rainbow trouts and German brown trouts, when there's a big flood, say in the Grand Canyon, which normally only happens now when they do a simulated release of a pre-dam flood. But all the non-native fish get swept miles down the river, and the only ones that are left are the natives. They just sort of tilt their noses down, and the water runs over their backs. And then in the more desert areas, you have, these are desert pupfish, not very remarkably huge or you know, colorful fish, but really amazing because they can survive in the mud, even with no water, for maybe a couple of years. And you know, what happens to when a wetland is gone, it was a place where birds, the Pacific Flyway, all the birds coming up the Pacific coast, they come up from the south, from Mexico. They have to have water you know, on their route, and there are very few places now for them to refuel. Stanley, identify. That's a warbler. Okay, all right, sorry. All right, it's my bird person. Of course, there are egrets everywhere. And down, one of the things about that's happened with the flow being like it is, not only have the lives changed for the animals, but the habitat, which also affects the lives of the animals. You know, it's not just water, but the way that the flooding, everything evolved. You know, like the Kukapa people, their whole culture evolved for this. The animals, you know, who have been there much longer, they evolved, and the plants evolved for certain conditions, and those all changed. And so this is a non-native plant called tamarisk, which anyone from maybe the Southwestern U.S. would know. But it's taken over so many of the riparian areas all over the desert and outcompeted mesquite trees and willows willows and cottonwoods mainly right next to the river. And, there are these, it's just everywhere and along the river. And, here, this is a little restoration project. And, we're talking about everywhere, hundreds and hundreds of miles of Colorado River, and tributaries have this in it. So this is like a 200-acre restoration site, which is wonderful, and it's really come a long way. But we're talking 200 acres in northwestern Mexico and southwestern United States, and we're not even close to Central Park there. But there are still miracles down there. There was a part of Arizona that was put into irrigation in the early 60s. It was Gila River water, which would flow into the Colorado. And when the irrigation runoff went into the Colorado for the first year of irrigation of this area, it had been an inland sea, so there's so much salt in the soil. The irrigation water leached all the salt out, and the Mexican farmers started irrigating with what they were getting, and it started killing the plants. I mean, there was so much salt in it. So, instead of saying, the smart thing would be to say, the Bureau of Reclamation, who makes all the dams, they would say, yeah, this was a huge mistake, we're going to buy you out. So instead, no, that's not how we do things. We're going to build a $300 million desal plant in Yuma, and so that we can continue to irrigate this land and basically grow alfalfa out there on hugely subsidized water. But so they couldn't put this irrigation water into the Colorado. While they're building this desal plant, they kind of built a canal out into Mexico in this little discrete hole in the fence, the border fence, and this kind of stopped. They said, okay, this looks like a good place to stop. So they stopped the canal, and it started, all this irrigation water that started running into there, and it flooded these farmers' fields there in this little ejido, this cooperative village, and they were never really compensated. But it turned out it was the perfect salinity for cattails and tule marshes, and it's like the older people here remember Tang, it was like you just add water and you would have sort of orange juice. It's like you just add water and you could have a wetland again. I mean, what it did was, it was the first time people understood the potential for recovery was actually there, depending on how much we could get. And until the water becomes so, I mean, they ran the desal plant for about a month, and it was so expensive and such a huge energy hog. They said, we can't do this. We wasted $300 million. We can't even run this thing. So they mothballed it, and I guess waiting to a point where water becomes so valuable that they can justify running it. And at that point, that's going to cut off this water source. And the native people, this is the Colorado River Indian Reservation. I mean, you sort of get what's left. What's left after you build the first commercial wave machine in the world in Tempe? No, or is it Mesa, Arizona, in the desert? And this was it's another 105-degree day out there. This is Las Vegas. Of course, everything is irrigated. And I was actually, I started riding my bike to do this photography after a while. These parts of my life kind of got together again. I thought, this is kind of an environmental story, and I'm out here, I'm already flying out here, and maybe I'm renting a car, and I could, I'm thinking it, especially nowadays as a film photographer, and the way it slows you down, especially shooting medium format film, have to reload every 10 frames. And so I wanted to see things at a more human speed, which I thought, because of the breadth of this entire project, the infrastructure, I thought it was a good way to see that even vast landscapes are only just a collection of millions of little details. Here's the granddaddy of them all, the Hoover Dam. There's mostly Navajo people there. That's the Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Powell, in what was once one of the most, probably the most remote part of the United States outside of Alaska. It was a Labor Day weekend. It's a real Labor Day weekend kind of a place. The Grand Canyon, which I initially kind of avoided because it seemed too obvious. And then I realized that people don't understand. No, that's the river I'm talking about, the Colorado. That's the one that cut the Grand Canyon. So I got a trip into there. I managed to get on a raft trip. I'm bouncing all over this vast area. This is the Salton Sea, which is totally full of, this is all Colorado River water. It's all irrigation runoff. It has no outlet. And the salinity in it is far greater than the ocean now. There's only tilapia are the only fish that can kind of survive in there. And it's a really fascinating story how it started. It all had to do with, incredible hubris, but I don't have time to tell you that now, so I'm just going to keep going. So much of the river is agriculture. There's so many, lots going to the cities, more and more is going to the cities, but most of it is still outdoor use, agriculture. And I always tell people, whenever you buy your scallions at the store, and you see the little blue rubber band on them, you need to stop for a moment and meditate on how it got there and how a day starts at 4:30 in the morning for children and goes until about sundown. And that's how your scallions are put together. That's the last little town. There's a religious festival down in one of the last towns in the Delta. This guy I've met on the first day, Juan Butron, really great, soulful guy. He's taught me a lot of Spanish and a lot of bad words that he thought would be useful for me. He did, there's this mesa near where he lives. He planted this mesquite tree and he goes out and waters it every day, because it would die. Everything is Colorado River water there. Those are his grandkids. They're doing the washing there. One's in Mexico, and one is up in El Centro, as they call it, in California. Up by the headwaters again. And he's actually building, he and his pals are building a dam out of sand on the beach. Asparagus, which you're probably starting to see in the stores. That's how you get it. That's near El Centro. That's all Colorado River. It's about 60 miles away from the river there. It's actually below sea level at that point. So it runs downhill. That's the Cap Canal in Arizona. People just drive over these things on the interstate and don't really even give them a second thought, but this is how Tucson exists as we know it. And I'm going to sort of finish these pictures with this. I talked about the potential There was this agreement that happened with, it took years to put together with environmentalists on both sides of the border, the US government, the Bureau of Reclamation, the Mexican government, and there was some surplus water, basically by people who had decided they weren't going to irrigate. So there was some extra water, and they decided that this year they were going to open up, this is the Morelos Dam, and I mean the border, the US border is right there on the other side of it. And they opened these gates up and put water into the main stream of the river again, instead of going into the canals for the first time. And they wanted to see what would happen. And there were scientists were planning for years for this, and all kinds of instruments were put in, all kinds of, bird, fish, riparian habitat research was in place to see what would happen and what the long-term effect would be. And as you can see, I mean, this is what's there. So the river, I was down there for a couple of weeks and just waiting for the river, and it would just, there was, it was so dry, it just soaked into the dirt. And this is all this dirt is from, like the Grand Canyon. It's all this finely ground dirt for millions of years coming down the river. What I have written down about it, this is an amazing fact. For all that the Nile and the Mississippi are renowned for their alluvial deltas, the Colorado outstripped their ratio of silt to water by a factor of 7. On average, the river carried enough material to build a levee 20 feet high, 20 feet wide, and a mile long every single day. Put another way, in any given year, it could bear the entire Imperial Valley in Southern California under 6 inches of sediment. But, with 2 inches of rain a year, and then the river, so it was just soaking in. So you're watching this like slow motion kind of flood, because the water's, most of it's going into the ground, but then it's moving forward, about 6 inches a minute, it seemed. Sometimes it was a little faster. And here, this is the same spot. I mean, just to the side of where that truck was. And this little kid had never seen the river there. That's the river channel. He had never in his life seen the river. And for 2 weeks it was there. And then they closed up the dam. They put the water back into the canals, and it dried up. And that was that. Here are people in San Luis, Rio Colorado. It's right on the border. The water came back to their city. Their city's named after St. Louis of the Colorado River. But there's a bridge there over a dry land. There's my friend Juan, the guy who waters the mesquite. So he's waiting for the water to come down the river. He's sort of a funny guy, but he's sort of making, he's waiting for hours out there in the sun. And eventually it came. Okay. I could go through, I'm just going to go through these really quick. So all this is film. I sort of jumped. That was the end. So that was, as I kind of forgot, that was the last of those Colorado River images. So I've been working on that. I don't know when I'll finish. Every time I think I'm finished, then something interesting happens, and I think, okay, well, I got to go out and I'll shoot that, and then that'll be it. So anyway, I'm going to just cycle through these. So I've been photographing the resistance, and then this will take about, I'm not going to linger here. These are the only digital photos that were taken in this entire. And these were all from the Women's March. So they're out dancing in the street, and this guy decided instead of driving around, he would just drive his bus right through them. That was from here, the Yemeni bodega owners demonstration, which was, this scary terrorist grandpa here. Just I love New York City. I love all the people here. Everybody I know is living in angst. So I decided I just was photographing this. So. That's what I'm doing here locally, so I don't have to go all the way out to the desert. That's it. That's it. That's enough.
We have time for a short Q&A. I'll pass around the mic. It doesn't amplify your voice, but it's for
Wow.
the video, so please use it.
8 o'clock. I did actually hit it?
Yeah, you did it.
On the nose.
Wow, I've never actually been on time for anything. Hi.
Hi, my name is Brooklyn, and I am a
Hi.
graduate student here with Katrine, getting my master's in digital photography. I want to say thank you for being so brave to share your story with us of what you've gone through and how you've come to be the man you are today through photography. One of the questions I wanted to ask is, through your journey, what was it through the photography that kept you going? I know there had to be days where you just didn't want to get up, you didn't want to do it, but the passion of photography saw you through. Can you recall a moment when that became clear?
What kept me going? I guess I didn't know what to do. And I didn't know what was going on with me. A lot of the time I didn't know why. I remembered this guy coming at me and hitting me, but then there's this space, and then there was this new experience of the world. And really, I had to go back, I guess, and I felt, I don't even know, I think it took about a year before I even figured out, I guess I'm photographing my own experience here, because all of these things at the Sierra Gates, it's stuff that I did myself, the therapy that I did myself, and there was photography really did, that John Berger quote, photography relieves us of the burden of memory. It jumped out at me when I read it. I think I was actually living at Sierra Gates when I was reading it. And I thought, I can look at this film, a couple of weeks from now, and I can understand that this really happened, and sometimes I just forget things, and then something reminds me, and it's quite amazing. I thought that it would be great if the photography could be used like that for people with brain injuries, because it was a way of sort of reorienting yourself. And I think I guess I'm not really answering your question. I think that's what the photography was for me. I was really closely observing these people, and I felt, I didn't really even feel like a photographer. I didn't feel like I was part of a community of photographers anymore. I felt like I was a community of people who had, had these horrible things happen and had hit their brains, and that's who I felt most in common with. And watching them in the way that you have to watch people to photograph them, I think it taught me a lot about myself, and I think I didn't, if you had asked me that when I was doing this, I don't know, I could have told you that, but maybe something in me understood that. So that's, and also, I just had nothing else going on in my life, you know. I mean, it was photography. It felt good to go out and felt natural to photograph again. It felt like something that I was searching for that I had lost, and I didn't want to be afraid to photograph anymore, and I slowly got over it that way. Anyway, that's a really long answer. I don't know if there's even an answer. I'm sorry if it wasn't. Okay.
I was really intrigued by the comment you made about the bicycle and how you decided to start, bicycling as you were doing.
Oh yeah, that was
the
kind of
work.
like as an aside almost, right? It wasn't even.
Yeah, can you give us a little bit more, information?
Yeah, there's
on
so much
that
I could, I was really trying not to go over, so I kind of glossed over some things. It's like, again, I don't really sometimes put a lot of. I'm not a very good planner. I wasn't a great planner before I got hurt, and I'm a really terrible planner now. And I don't think I think things through a lot. I don't, or I'd be finished with this project. And
but maybe
and so I decided. Okay, I want to slow down and There was a. So I have this bicycle. Okay, so it's got 20-inch wheels. It's about like a BMX, like a kid's bike, but it folds up. I found this great thing. I bought it used on Craigslist, and it folds into a 31-inch Samsonite suitcase. So, I mean, it's not like just you got to kind of assemble some stuff. There's some wrenching to do, but it's still it flies as a regular bag. And I get out, and then the suitcase, there's some smart people figure out how to, there's this thing that sort of snaps together with thumb screws in these 3 holes you drill in the bottom of the suitcase, and that becomes a trailer. So with like stroller wheels, that's what you think, well, what can we use? Well, these stroller wheels we'll have for the trailer. And it snaps onto the back of this folding bike, and I just ride away from the airport or the bus station, and I've got it kind of figured out how to carry my stuff. I've got sort of a backpack and a handlebar bag, and I carry a Mia 7 in one, and Mia 7 the handlebar bag, and and like all the film I can carry. And Kodak didn't even talk to me when they stopped making Tri-X 320, 220 film, and I used to at least get 20 exposures a roll. Now I have to carry twice as much because they're the same size, really. But it slows, and I mean, that's being a film photographer. Those of us who are of that era, I mean, and especially the medium format ones, I mean, I don't think I've ever shot, maybe I used to have to shoot football games and things, like, I think I shot a Super Bowl once, basically so I could go to New Orleans. That's the only reason I agreed. But I don't think I shot 800. Someone said, yeah, I shot 800 frames. I think, man, I've never shot 800 frames. I don't know if I've ever done that in my life. And, on a big day out in the Colorado River, I maybe shoot 200 pictures. That's like a big day. And all the gyrations, to get out there and ride your bike around. And, so you think you're slowing down. You're trying to think about what it is you're seeing. And what's important to photograph. So, and I feel that it makes, I understand the geography of the river a little bit more, in more human terms, because it's a really long river, and we've kind of, made it into this, it's like a plumbing system, and it's not even, real in a way. We don't experience the geography in a real way. You know, we don't, even the places where we live out there, they're not. So it was all to try and understand it better. And I don't know if it really has helped me. I think maybe it has. There's a few things that I saw that I just wouldn't have seen in a car, I know for sure. Like that 4 o'clock in the morning, that broken fountain of, you know, gushing irrigation water that no one else saw except for me, because I was out on my bike at 4 in the morning going to Agua Dam. I don't know, it wasn't that fascinating, was it? I don't know.
So with these things like this water project, it's so many different things happening there, and it's so overwhelming. And
yeah, it was really kind of dumb of me, like with my condition.
You have a very unique perspective on this because you've kind of seen all these different aspects of it and talked to all these different people.
Yeah.
Do you see any hope there? Like, do you think that there's any practical things that like people can do to somehow contribute or help or?
I think actually part of it, and again, I don't think I you know, sometimes as photographers, the photographers will know, sometimes you're photographing something and you see it later, you know, when you're looking at it, you're not even sure, you weren't even conscious about something when you're photographing it. You're not even consciously aware, it's sort of your intuition, but you saw that you were definitely, so that's, I think maybe the river, a lot of it was after what happened to me with my brain. I think a lot of what I understood about what we've done to the river has a lot to do about perception and how we perceive, you know, what we're perceiving the river as this one thing that it clearly wasn't until the 1930s, and we've perceived that we could have this whole outrageous civilization out there. You know, it's what, 30 million people? I've heard up to 40 million. You know, I think it's arguable how many people, but a lot of people out there in Northwest Mexico and Southwest United States depend on the river. And you know, now that climate change is going to accelerate, now that we're going to be the coal nation, you know, that all this water, like it comes out of Lake Havasu, which was that little blot of shiny reflective water at the corner. It's at the Arizona-California border. They pump it over a 1,000-foot mountain and take it out to the California coast through one of the hottest deserts in the country. And it goes south of Joshua Tree. They've got to pump it over some more mountains, and it's evaporating all the way. And Lake Mead and Lake Powell, they're all evaporating. They're in very hot places. And, you know, there are computer models of this stuff. What's going to happen, you know, when just a few degrees, you know, not even a full degree of annual mean temperature rise, how much more evaporation that's going to be. That's much less water for the people out there, which the populations keep growing. So I don't know. I mean, I don't see, you know, the first time since I started this project, there are people talking about, I mean, even the so-called water buffaloes, the water district managers, they're saying, well, you know, maybe we're going to have to decommission Glen Canyon Dam. I mean, to keep water at an operable level above so-called dead pool, if you get down to a point called dead pool, it can't go through the power turbines. I mean, all kinds of dominoes start kind of falling. And you have to keep both of those lakes at that level. And to keep Lake Mead at that level, you got to take water out of Lake Powell. But, you know, at a certain point, there's just not, they're in a drought now that has been going since 2000. And, you know, a bunch of marinas on Lake Powell have been closed. And they thought, you know, seasonally, no, it's permanently. They're never going to open. I mean, the river has sort of reclaimed a lot of the back end of of Lake Powell. You know, it's the Colorado River again. But yeah, I don't know. I don't see a lot of hope. I mean, Las Vegas has actually done a lot for water conservation, but you know, there's a point. Right now in front of everybody, I'm forgetting the term. I think it's called hardening the supply. So at a certain point, you keep conserving, right? And everybody's using soaker hoses, but that allows you to continue to grow at this rate, right? Because you're conserving. But then you have another drought, and you've already hardened the supply. Then what do? You can't continue to harden it. I mean, you can't conserve. When you reach the point where you can't conserve anymore, then you're really up against it. And I don't know. I mean, I've joked, you know, I mean, call me an optimist, but I think that it's a joke. That, you know, that there's going to be a migration out of the southwestern U.S. cities that's going to make, you know, Katrina look like a kindergarten picnic. I mean, I don't know how this is going to continue. You know, I mean, who's going to? Anyway, so I could go on. Okay. So no, not much. But people disagree, you know.
Thank you so much, John,
Okay.
for a wonderful lecture.
Okay, thanks.